podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke DeWolf.
In this episode, we continue our exploration of the Poetic Edda, and we'll be looking at the very famous poem, Baldr's Dream. How you doing, Luke?
I'm good, Dan. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Are you looking forward to this poem?
I am. We've had this poem coming up for a very long time, and we knew we would be revisiting the Death of Baldr in this poem. And there's just so much here. It's one of the shortest poems. It might even be the shortest one in the whole Poetic Edda. I don't actually remember if there's anyone shorter, but this is only 15 stanzas long. But there's just so much in that 15 stanzas. Like, we're back to the level of when we were going through the Voluspa, and every stanza had something important. So we're going to have a good time with this episode.
I think so too. And I was trying to think. I think it is the shortest one. Even with the Kalevala, like there were a few short ones in the Kalevala, but I think with just 15 stanzas, this is the shortest one. But it's also just filled to the brim with things to talk about.
Exactly. And maybe just to go into a little bit of detail about the poem. So yeah, this is Baldr's Dreams, Baldrs Draumar, and this is not actually in the Codex Regius, which we have most of the Poetic Edda from that manuscript, but it appears in the manuscript AM 748I4TO, which also includes several other poems that do occur in the Codex Regius, such as Harbardsljóð and Humiskvida. So we do know that this poem is related to other poems in the Poetic Edda, and of course the content of this poem means that it's perfect for us to cover. So even if it wasn't in some original collection of poems that became the Codex Regius, this is still going to be a fantastic poem for us to cover because it goes into so much about Baldr and Odin and what they both mean on a symbolic level. And yeah, I'm just really excited for this one.
Awesome. So before we dive right in, if you want to get in touch with us, all of our social media is in the descriptions below. If you want to support us, we are now on Patreon, and that's probably the best way to support us. It lets us do a whole bunch of cool things like improve our hardware and all that kind of stuff. And before we go on, just so we're all on the same page, literally, we're, of course, using the Poetic Edda translated by Jackson Crawford. And you can also follow along with an audio version of it where Jackson Crawford actually is the person reading it out. So also a great option to follow along. And our thanks to Hackett Publishing for letting us use this awesome resource. And I think with that, we can dive right in.
Let's do it.
So Baldr's Dream. Back to the poem. And this will just be the first stanza. Once all the gods met for a conference. All the goddesses met for a conference. And the mighty gods talked about why Baldr was having bad dreams. Luke, what does that mean?
Well, Dan, there's a lot to unpack from this stanza. And I think before we get any further, let's do a little bit of a recap of who Baldr is and where we've seen him before. Now, we have seen the story of the Death of Baldr in the Voluspa. That was in our second episode when we covered that story originally. And there are a couple of other places where the story of the Death of Baldr is located, including the Prose Edda. And that Prose Edda version includes some different details that we're going to compare and contrast. But the gist of the story of the Death of Baldr and his symbolic significance, he is the son of Odin and Frigg. He is the best god, and he is the combination of the king, which is Odin, and the queen, which is Frigg. And on a symbolic level, that means Baldr is the potential of the both of them realized for the next generation. And the thing about that is that this potential, this symbolic potential that Baldr represents, really is everything that Odin has been working towards the entire time that he has been building up knowledge and trying to prepare for the worst things that can happen Ragnarok being the best example, but Baldr really represents the absolute best potentially that could come from Odin's life and Frigg's life, and the joining of the two of them together in the cosmic marriage, the Heros Gamos, which underlies so much of symbolic significance for ancient cultures. And the thing about Baldr that I make a distinction on based on the way he's described, he's always described as shining. His hall is shining. His hall is a bright place. He is, to me, a symbolic ideal. He symbolizes the best possible version of yourself that could possibly exist, either now or in the future. And the reason that I make this distinction symbolically is, first of all, the way he's positioned between being the son of Odin and Frigg, and as well this premonition of death. Baldr not only is the potential for Odin on a literal level, but on a symbolic level, he represents everything that Odin could possibly achieve beyond his own life. And so in terms of being an ideal, that's what Baldr represents on a psychological level. And so to kind of wrap that all up, Baldr is not only the son of Odin and Frigg, but he's also the potential of the next generation and the ideal. So when Baldr is having bad dreams, and I'll be clear, he doesn't say in the poem that it's necessarily about his death, but Dr. Crawford clarifies in the description for this poem that it is, in fact, dreams about his death, that these bad dreams are some kind of subconscious understanding that something is wrong, that something bad could happen, and perhaps even that there's something wrong with the ideal that you have for yourself, the goals, the potential, everything that you're putting into the ideal version of yourself. There's something wrong there. There's something that isn't going to let it be possible. And the thing is, if Baldr dies, if the ideal dies, if the potential for the next generation dies, what's going to happen? So, all the gods meet up for a conference. This affects everything. It's the concern of all of society. All the gods care if Baldr dies. And so the totality of this one stanza is that everything is at risk. Everything for the next generation is at risk. The best possible version of the future is at risk, and the gods need to figure it out. That's my take.
That's pretty great, because that's pretty much where I was going to go with it. But that's, yeah, I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly it. Like, you've got the gods and goddesses, basically the heads of the dominance hierarchies for their particular hierarchy. They're meeting and they're saying, this child, the one that's the best of all of us. Carl Jung talks about the marriage between, order and chaos, and then the fruit of that being the divine child who is the best of both, and who is able to exist in both worlds, straddling the line between the two. That's what Baldr is, just as you were saying, and that's why he is the best god. He is the brightest. His name, there are a few different ways to translate it. Some people think like the bright one or anything, or bright one, the shining one. I've also seen like the bright new day kind of thing. So it's all about that rebirth and that potential, and sort of, if you were to mix all of the best things together, this is what you would get. It is the ideal, like you were saying. But he's having bad dreams. And so it rightfully concerns all of the gods who are the top of their hierarchies. Well, they're worried that this person who embodies the top of all of the hierarchies is having bad dreams. Like, what does that mean? Like, that's not a good thing. It doesn't bode well. And, we see that, archetypally in society, like you were saying, that when you have the next generation, the children are our future. Well, they are, because they're going to live on after you're dead. But what happens when they're having bad dreams, when the sort of, well, like the general psyche of that next generation is having bad dreams, right? Like, what does that mean? Well, one, we're going to find out in this poem, but it's not good. And of course, they're these, well, at this point, I mean, they're kind of old gods, right? The next generation's already there. They're trying to figure out, well, how are we going to make it okay for Baldr, who is the best, to bring in the new world and the great new things that, the next generation is going to have. So it's quite the, quite dramatic opening, and it really shows you what the stakes are. It's like, this is the future in no uncertain terms.
Right. And I like your comparison to the new generation as far as the new generation having bad dreams. I see a parallel to that in there has been an uptick in the last few years that's been measured statistically through studies and all that in mental health problems in kids or university students and things like that. And, it really should be the concern of all society that gets dealt with, that the next generation is able to correctly handle themselves in society and eventually get jobs and things like that and be productive. And in a lot of cases, if kids are starting to self-harm in greater and greater rates, and if there is a huge increase in diagnosed mental disorders and things, the sum of that really is that there are going to be problems well into the future. And it's going to be difficult to fix, because if these kids grow up and start having kids of their own, or maybe some percentage of them doesn't even get to having kids or influencing society in any way, you suddenly have less potential for the future going well into the future, if that makes sense. And it on a macro level, on a high level, that's a problem for society as a whole. But on a micro level as well, it's also a problem. If you're talking about the Baldr, the character, Baldr, the individual, Baldr, the son of Odin, Odin cares about his son. Odin cares about the well-being of his son on a personal level. What Baldr represents symbolically is a larger thing, certainly, and what we see today in terms of rates of self-harm, mental health, things like that, that's certainly occurring on a macro level that we can measure statistically, but on a micro level, on a really low level, for every individual, that's got to be terrible. For every family that this affects, that's got to be terrible too. So, and I think the parallel as well to meeting for a conference to figure this out, that's the best way to do it, because it's like, yeah, this is the concern of all of society, whether it's on a high level or a low level, and making sure that the next generation is equipped and able to function. It's important. And if there are bad dreams, I don't necessarily want to completely directly tie this to mental health problems in general, because this is a premonition of something different, of his death, and I am going to take this into symbolic places that aren't really related to mental health exactly, but it's an interesting parallel to explore.
Definitely. I mean, I think we're both not going to make the argument that, we're living in the end times before Ragnarok and everything, but it's interesting. Well, we always talk about, find the myth that you're living. Well, I'm not going to say that this is the myth that we're living, but if you do see parallels, it's something to like pay attention to, right? I mean, I think Ragnarok, as of the recording date, was supposed to happen, I think, in 2017, if I recall correctly, from the end of the world people, whoever they are. But yeah, I remember reading in the newspaper, it was like, oh, get ready for Ragnarok in February, something like that. But yeah, no, it's again, we're not saying that, we're heading for a Ragnarok, but just, if you're seeing parallels in a myth, pay attention. That's all. Shall I move on?
Yeah, definitely.
This will be stanzas 2 and 3. Odin stood up, that father of gods, and he saddled his horse Sleipnir. Then he rode down to Hel, till he saw the dog of Hel. The dog had a bloody chest and barked a long time, as Odin passed. Odin rode on, the stones of the road rattled, till he came to the high house of Hel.
Well, okay. Odin is taking action. And Odin being the one to take this ride, this makes sense. He's the one taking responsibility. He's the king. He's the top of the dominance hierarchy. This is his responsibility. Not even just because this is his son we're dealing with, also because for what Baldr symbolically represents, it's the king's responsibility. It's absolutely his responsibility to take care of what is going to happen. Now, riding down to Hel. This is descending into the underworld. This is easily one of the most archetypally transparent symbols that we can deal with here. He is literally going into the underworld. He's descending into chaos. And on a couple of levels here, that makes sense. First of all, the information that he seeks is not in explored territory. It's not known. If the solution to Baldr's problems was known, or the gods were able to come up with it between them when they're meeting for their conference, then there wouldn't be any reason for Odin to go seek it out in the underworld. And maybe that sounds trivial. Maybe that sounds like I'm just saying, yeah, they knew it. But it's also just to emphasize here that in cases where knowledge isn't known, you do have to go out and search for it. And of course, today we've got some of the best tools for finding new information, Google being probably the best. But the thing about it is that this is deeper information. This is something that is on a level beyond the type of wisdom that we've dealt with before, the facts about the world, even the deeper meaning behind characteristics in the world, which we know Odin knows. He doesn't know the answer to this. He doesn't know the answer to why his son is having bad dreams about his death. He maybe doesn't even know what it represents. He doesn't know the consequences. And so he's doing the best thing possible, which is to voluntarily go out into the unknown to try and get the answer. And this isn't trivial. This is dangerous. Being in unexplored territory in the unknown isn't something you do lightly. It's not something that you do just on a whim. Even if you go voluntarily, going voluntarily is better than going involuntarily. Like being thrown into chaos involuntarily is not great, not good at all. But voluntarily going in, at least you have some control over your own actions and you know where you're entering, sort of thing. You know where you're sort of going to try to probe the underworld. But it's still not trivial. It's still dangerous. And that, I think, is what the reference to the dog of Hel represents. The dog, it's barking a long time. The bloody chest, I think that must mean something like the dog has been eating some stuff very graphically, and the blood is getting onto its chest, sort of thing. And so the dog is dangerous. It's probably Garm, possibly Fenrir, depending on those two are sometimes considered to be the same anyway, but it's probably Garm who howls when Ragnarok is just about to start. And if it's Fenrir, he's going to escape when Ragnarok starts. I think it's probably Garm, at least on the where he is kind of guarding the door to hell. But you have to get past the dog. The dog can kill you. The dog is dissuading Odin from going further. And you know what? Odin's got this. He's going on. Maybe he's afraid, maybe he's not afraid, but he can handle the situation and he's going forward, and the answer that he's seeking is important enough. So all of this together, Odin is descending into the underworld.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I was reading about Garm, and his name they're not exactly sure where his name comes from, but they suspect it's something like growl or like grr, like literally just that, the sound a guarding dog makes. And you can find dogs in virtually every mythology throughout the world, and they cover sort of every function that you can imagine. But one of the big functions that they do is that they often do is guarding liminal space, that space in between, consciousness and unconsciousness, or, the middle world, Midgard, and hell. So finding a dog here is exactly what you'd expect. You can see another very famous example of a dog guarding hell is Cerberus in Greek mythology, a three-headed dog. And one of the reasons why they're a liminal creature is that they're a friend to humans, man's best friend, but they still have that wolfish aspect to them that you can generally be like, yeah, no, my dog's going to be calm and figure out how it's going to act. But there's always those times when, dogs can go a little crazy, and that's when you get like the maulings and things like that. They're not completely safe, of course. So they do have that duality. And I think that's a perfect representation of the guard of hell, that liminal space where you have to get past that in order to travel from Midgard to this other place, or Asgard, let's say. You have to get past this liminal creature, and if you can't, then you're not able to cross that boundary. But if you can, then you're able to go beyond. And I think when we see the line, Odin rode on, the stones of the road rattled, I think that's saying that he's got complete mastery over travel, and he is known as a traveler. And so that he's able to pass by the dog Garm quite easily, because he is at that the top of that hierarchy, right? Like, so it's something that, us mere mortals, we'd probably freak out because there's a huge dog with blood all over it guarding where we want to go. We'd probably be like, you know what, maybe not today, or next time bring something to appease Garm. But Odin, no, he's on his huge horse with 8 legs, and it's just like, no, this is where I'm going, and there's nothing this dog can do to me. So it really shows the power of Odin, and the power of being at the top of a dominance hierarchy, because it allows you to travel to these places sort of easily.
Yeah, and the thing about it is that if you're taking it to a practical level, I don't think it means necessarily that it's a good idea to ignore potential dangers and risks on the road, sort of thing. First of all, on the one hand, yeah, Odin is special. Odin is the top of the dominance hierarchy, as you said. But the thing, too, is that on a practical level, it also says that, I think, that if there are obstacles in your way, potentially dangerous obstacles, you have to take the risk sometimes of, getting eaten by a bloody dog. That's maybe a hard risk to take, but at least getting past those obstacles to getting to the next step, getting to the next phase, crossing the liminal boundary. Being able to do that is, I think, what separates a lot of the most successful from the least successful in the world here, because it's kind of like, if you've got something worth doing, there's always going to be risks associated with it. And sometimes you can get the bloody dog who is very scary for good reason. And, if you can't get past the dog, what are you going to do? So Odin wouldn't be getting past, if you weren't getting past the dog, he wouldn't be doing anything. And so I think just on some level, it's a story element that, I'm sure even in, say, like the Greek mythology with Cerberus, or any other story where these dogs are involved, like the hero gets past the dog, right? Like that's the idea. So if you're trying to embody what Odin is doing here. On some level, it's like, yeah, you got to face your fears, you got to face these scary things and get past it in order to achieve what you need to achieve, or else you're not going to get into the unknown, which has all the rewards.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. Shall we move on into hell?
Let's do it.
Stanzas 4 and 5. Back to the poem. Then Odin rode east of the door to hell, and there he found the grave of a witch. And then the battle god spoke a spell, till her corpse was forced to rise, and spoke, "Who is this man unknown to me, who has brought me back to loathsome life? I was buried in snow, pelted by rain, drowned in dew. I was dead a long time."
A spell to awaken a corpse. That's some powerful magic right there. And Odin certainly is special in having that power. And the implication here for what he's doing in all this is that he's going to seek information. And therefore, what this spell actually means, beyond just being a spell to awaken a corpse, which is pretty cool, but what the spell means in terms of its significance is that it's to retrieve any knowledge that this witch might have. And the idea of the dead being able to see, first of all, the future, but also containing lost knowledge, that's a huge idea. And the thing is, I think that's something that still makes sense today, because virtually everyone who has ever lived has not passed down everything that they know in a form that has survived today, or at least everything important that they know. Certainly, nobody has passed on everything they know, but many people these days are able to write books, they're able to create great things and pass this knowledge down. But prior to the advent of books, printing, the internet, writing, any of these technologies kind of all at once, before that, everything would have had to be passed down person to person, and memories are fallible. Some of these oral traditions that we deal with, which certainly all the contents of the Poetic Edda would have originally been oral tradition, and the Kalevala as well, that was oral tradition right up until the 1800s when it was compiled. Oral traditions are extremely powerful, and they have extremely long memories, but they can lose details, and they can lose specific bits of knowledge. And I've even had conversations with people where it's kind of like, yeah, wouldn't it be amazing to be able to talk to some people who have died, who have passed on, who don't have all of their knowledge passed down into future generations? And yeah, that would absolutely be amazing. That's essentially one of the spells that Odin talks about being able to do in the Havamal, right? With the runes. It's a big idea, and it's a great idea. It's something that if humanity as a whole were able to get mastery of, that would be truly amazing. It would be a breakthrough beyond breakthroughs, really. But the thing about it is, first of all, it's something we kind of don't have. So getting to a symbolic significance for what that means exactly can be hard, I think. At a minimum, what it says to me is that the knowledge, the deepest knowledge, requires going into the underworld because it's not necessarily going to be comfortable to retrieve that knowledge. And we have different versions of the unknown in Norse mythology. They have Jotunheim, which for the most part is pretty much just like Midgard, the known world, except it's inhabited by giants, and so it's in the unknown. And so going there and having adventures and stuff is totally possible and not so bad. But Odin going into hell, that's pretty different. And the only thing I could get from Odin riding east of the door to hell was that he's not even going into the known bits of hell. He's going past the known bits, which is Hell's Hall, which is the domain of the queen of the underworld. But no, he's not even going there. He's going further. And so that's where you get that kind of knowledge from, and it can be hard journeys. And I maybe don't have anything better for what it might mean to awaken a corpse, because we can't do that. And on a symbolic level, it's a little fuzzy what that would actually mean practically, but it's still a pretty cool little spell that Odin has, and it definitely means that he's going for some deep knowledge.
Oh, definitely. So I've actually got an answer for you for East. East is symbolic of the rising sun of a new day. And so he goes east to bring new life to this corpse that can, it's funny because you usually think of a new day as like, yeah, this is great, it's a new day, and not like dragging up old bones and giving it this second life that they detest, and you're going to be like dragging information out of them, like interrogating them. It also kind of made me think of Odin's, I guess, how he often will force himself on women. It's not, and actually we'll get into a little bit more of that later, but, Odin often doesn't really care what people, and women in particular, are thinking. If he can find a use for them, he is going to use them. And, if they're not happy about it, well, he's Odin, so there's nothing that they can really do. And we'll see again and again, she'll want to go back into her death, right? And go back to sleep. And Odin's like, no, I'm not done talking to you. And that's that. As far as the magic goes, and the runes, because he does talk about a rune that would make him able to speak to the dead. I take that as written language almost, because we can read books from people who are long dead and still get their knowledge and see if it applies today. Because I guess one of the conceits that we have, one of the things that we assume, at least in this podcast and doing this, is that human nature doesn't really change. The circumstances around it change for sure, but humans are more or less the same creatures. And if you put them in a certain situation, doesn't matter whether it's 500 years ago or 500 years in the future, you're going to kind of be able to tell what they're going to do. It might not be exact, but you'll have an idea. And so we have Odin going, like, digging deep into the past, looking for knowledge. And I would even argue that reading itself is a form of sort of quote unquote magic. I mean, we're looking at squiggles on a page, or, lines that have been arranged in a certain way that we can gather information. That's crazy. It's all just like, I would say talking is magic as well. We are pushing air into another person's ear and they're able to get information from that. That's bonkers. That doesn't even make sense. It's just crazy. So I can see how, and especially with Odin, because he's the one who brought in writing. Like, as you're talking about, it's an oral culture and it's an oral tradition. So writing is something special in this case. And it only, a very few people would be able to do it. Even when Snorri was compiling these stories, I mean, he was a well-educated person. Not many people were going to be able to do what he was doing, right? So now we, at least in the West, we all learn to read and write very young, and it's considered just like standard, right? But at the time, it's powerful and not common. So I wonder if that's sort of why it's a spell, why it's magical, because it is a very unique power that you would have had to study for a long time to be able to do properly. And of course, Odin going into hell, going into the unknown, looking for new knowledge in the East, waking up at this point, this poor corpse who was just sleeping. We have her talking about like how long she's been dead for, the cycle of life that, she's been buried in snow, pelted by rain, drowned in dew. Like, that pretty much covers the seasons, right? So she's been there for a while. But what Odin wants, at least for Odin, is important enough to wake this this dead witch up and get some information. And it's funny, we were talking about this scary dog in this liminal space that he just blows by. It's like wow, like he got by this scary dog. Well, yeah, because he's going to raise a witch from the dead. It's like, okay, like he's on a whole other level than most of us, right? Like we would get by the dog and think, we got by the dog, this is good. He's like, no, now we have to raise the witch from the dead. So when it shows Odin sort of being special, there's a reason why he's a god, and also the lengths that he's willing to go to get new information. So
that's right. Whatever he's seeking is got to be important enough. I like that the witch says that life is loathsome, brought me back to loathsome life. And the thing about that, I think there is some kind of understanding on some level that life is pretty hard. It's kind of a cycle of endless suffering, if you want to be pessimistic about it. And on some level, dying, that's the escape from that. You're free from this cycle, all of the things that go on constantly that are hard, are a struggle. And maybe in comparison to being dead for this witch, or for maybe in general some people who might think it might be better on some level, it's that getting brought back to life is maybe not so fun. And I think it does just say something about the way life was understood and death was understood. And I don't think it's necessarily like death was seen as a good thing or a blessing or anything like that, but maybe there just is some understanding of how difficult life actually is. And the witch does not want to be brought back, and so that's clear enough.
Shall we move on?
Let's do it.
Stanzas 6 and 7. Back to the poem. Odin said, I am the road tamer, son of corpse tamer. Tell me news from hell, and I'll tell you news from above. Whose arrival are these benches draped with straw for? Why is the floor all covered in gold? The witch said, the mead is brewed for Baldr's arrival. A shield is placed over the fresh brew. All the gods are in suspense. I was forced to speak, now I return to silence.
Well, it's been confirmed. Baldr is going to die. Now, that's not completely clear based on what has been said here symbolically. Baldr is going to arrive in hell. There's only one way to do that, unless you're Odin, essentially, and that is to die. And it's interesting, too. Hell is being decorated for his arrival. Even in hell, Baldr is known as something special, somebody special. And it's a big event for them to receive Baldr. They're going to have a party. They're going to have a big feast. And, well, on some level, first of all, the significance of hell decorating itself for Baldr's arrival, I could see that as being on some level like, yeah, death has won. By Baldr arriving, they're celebrating because they have managed to take away everything that Baldr represents from the world above. And I don't know necessarily if I'm fully convinced on that. I think it, at a minimum, it is just the status of Baldr and him being important. And, well, in the story of the death of Baldr, it is that the entire world cries, with the exception of who is assumed to be Loki, but another giant type creature. And the whole world is sad, I think, including everything in hell as well. And Baldr is recognized for what he is, personally and symbolically. And so hell being decorated, that makes total sense, because no matter whether they're happy that he's there or, well, not so much happy, but they are at least recognizing his status and they're going to receive him well. And the thing about this, though, is that, first of all, the way Odin asks this, he suspects what's going on. And on some level, that means that kind of everyone sees what's going on, if they're at least willing to look. Odin's willing to look here. And Odin, to his great credit here, especially, like he's going and asking the questions. He's not ignoring it. He's not ignoring Baldr's dreams. And he's asking this question in kind of an oblique way, but he understands what's going on, and maybe that's his way of, okay, well, if there's some other reason that all this stuff, the floor being covered in gold, maybe if there's another reason for that, then okay, it's not so bad. But well, the witch confirms his fears, his worst fears. I mean, his son is going to die. Baldr will die. And the ideal is going to die. The potential is going to die. This has got to hit Odin really hard, because everything he's been working towards, everything he's been doing in the lead up to Ragnarok, or even just in his own life in general, without that being taken into consideration, that's gone now. That's going to be gone. Baldr's going to die, and as far as everyone knows, that's going to be it. And that's significant. I mean, who wants their ideal to die, their potential? Who wants that? And literally, who wants their children to die? Like, that's terrible. That's it's going to be a bad time for Odin, no matter what happens here. And yeah, honestly, this has just got to be crushing for him to hear that.
Oh, no doubt. Coming in and seeing hell set up like a feast, and then probably having a sneaking suspicion that it is for Baldr, and then having it confirmed would be crushing. And it's like you're saying, it's the death from ideal. It's driving Baldr into the unconsciousness. So if we're looking at it sort of as a symbol for society, all the best things that the previous generation of the society has, they want to bring that, they want to keep that in the forefront, keep that in the consciousness, so that the prosperity can continue and get even better. But we're seeing now that it's not going to get better, because that's going to be driven into the unconsciousness. And well, what will remain conscious of the next generation? What's going to be the thing that is out in the open if it's not Baldr? And that's a terrifying thing to think of, right? Like, because you have the absolute best, well, anything else is going to be not good in comparison. Because, and the other thing too is, you have it. Baldr's alive. Like, you've already got it there, and you're going to lose it. It'd be another thing if you didn't know Baldr was there, and you were kind of stumbling around looking for it. But to have it and to lose it, there's something tragic about that.
Yeah, and the thing too, I like extending it all the way to the societal level, because I think it means that if the ideal doesn't work, like, that's an entire generation. That's like everything that a society has built up to that point. It's crumbling and has to be built back up. And maybe that's foreshadowing a bit of what we're going to get into later, but it's significant. It's like parents seeing the world being screwed up by their kids or their grandkids, sort of thing, right? And on some level, you start to lose the ability to control that, right? Like, if Baldr's going to die, isn't Odin going to do everything he can do to stop it, sort of thing, right? And if Odin is powerless to save the life of his son, when he's able to do all these other things, that's got to be a little bit humbling. And it shows that Odin is not all powerful. He's the best god, but he's not all powerful. He's going to die in Ragnarok. He's not an omniscient, ever-present god by any stretch. He's going to die one day, and he can't save his son from death either. And that's got to be a major failing for him, because if the next generation is not going to be the best it possibly can be, well, that's everything Odin's been striving for, and it's not going to happen now. Now, the couple of names I just want to address a little bit, the Road Tamer, son of Corpse Tamer. Road Tamer, we've essentially seen, is that he's able to get onto the road past the dog. He's able to go into the unknown and tame the unknown, bring order to the unknown. Him going into hell. Now, hell is essentially a permanent place, but him going into it and being able to do anything in it, he's bringing a tiny piece of order into that gigantic realm of swirling chaos. And so that name makes quite a lot of sense. And then Corpse Tamer, I think, should be relatively obvious here too. It's saying he's the son of Corpse Tamer, but I don't think that's necessarily a distinction that's all that important here. He's got the power over corpses, right? And so interesting way for him to introduce himself. But yeah, then his question and answer come through, and yeah, there we go. But
I was just thinking, we actually have a really good example in real life of the consequences of the best and the brightest being driven underground and into the unconscious, out of the everyday. And we actually have a term for it. We call that generation the lost generation. It's the generation that fought in World War I. And like in Europe, imagine having these like the next generation and just annihilating them. Like if you want to get like, I'd say the best understanding of World War I, check out Dan Carlin's Blueprint for Armageddon. That I haven't heard or seen anything that digs into World War I as good as that, and really gets into the human toll of it, because it's just mind-boggling. Like I remember in one of the battles, and I don't remember which one, but like 1 million shells were dropped in a few hours, right? And there were people in their bunkers, and they were literally going insane, because the human body's not supposed to be under that kind of stress for that amount of time with that amount of noise. Like it's mind-boggling. But before that, like before World War I, you kind of had a golden age, right? Like you had like this British Empire where the sun never set. They were, colonialism is a whole other conversation, but if you look at it just from their perspective, they had land all around the world, so much so that the sun literally never set on British land. There was always somewhere in the empire. They had things were good, like people were, or at least the empire was rich. Like it was a good time, and it wasn't just Britain. I mean, Germany had the same thing too, right? Like all of these countries it was at this like really golden age, but they didn't see that there were things leading to war. And we have it's kind of a similar circumstance here, where you've got all these gods who are powerful in their own right, but they can't, and maybe they see something coming down the pipe, because a lot of times one of the reasonings for World War I was that, well, everyone was primed and ready for a fight, so they just decided to have one. Like it was sort of inevitable. All the tensions that were going on. But it's very similar, because Baldr's having these dreams of dying, and the gods are kind of powerless to do anything about it, and they're trying to. Odin tries to solve something, but or tries to figure out how to solve it, but it doesn't matter. Like we've got confirmation that Baldr is going to die, and it's going to take the best and the brightest of that next generation. And as we go on, I think we'll see that actually it all fits together quite well.
Yeah, I like the way you compare that to the whole generational thing, because I think this would have been in effect at the time of this writing. I mean, you can look at historical sources, things like that, but war was not pretty. War was not great. And any casualties, like when I watch the show Vikings, like I always think to myself, like the number of people dying is just way too much. Like there's no way that a society comes back from half their men dying. I think that's unrealistic, the amount that's shown in the battles and things like that there, but it's really maybe it is accurate though. I'm not an expert in the history of all that, but if half the men get wiped out, half the young men yeah, that's like the next generation is wiped out, is gone. And maybe that was on some level that was just reality, but on another level, maybe this story of the death of Balder was created as a way of coping with that. And well, I'll get into that in a little more detail, the whole coping sort of thing. But yeah, the death of Balder coming from the loss of the next generation. I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's well, I think it's worth exploring further for sure.
Shall we continue on with the poem and explore?
Let's do it.
So this is stanzas 8 and 9. Back to the poem. Odin said, "Don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more till I understand everything, and I want to know more. Who will be the killer of my son Balder? Who will steal the life of Odin's son?" The witch said, "Hoth will bear the long spear that will kill him. He will be the killer of your son Balder. He will steal the life of Odin's son. I was forced to speak, and now I return to silence."
Okay. I think this is a good spot to recap the story of the death of Balder, at least kind of on a general level. And the idea of the story of the death of Balder, it's touched on in the Voluspa, but the main thing to remember is that there are multiple versions of the death of Balder. So I'm going to go over just the basics of the one that we have covered before. And the one we've covered before is that Frigg gets all of the materials in the world to swear that they will not harm Balder in order to protect him. And the only one which she does not get to swear that particular oath is the mistletoe. And the mistletoe is interesting. It's kind of this harmful plant. Like it is toxic, and it's a parasite, and it lives on other plants. And so it's not a harmless plant. It's hard to die from say eating a mistletoe, but say if you create a tea from its leaves or something like that, that resulting tea will be very toxic because it's the leaves and the berries of the mistletoe that are the most toxic part. And Frigg does not think that that was worth bothering about. And I don't know necessarily exactly the symbolic significance of that. We've gone into some things before as far as the willful blindness of it, or the mistletoe seeming like it's not exactly harmful, even though it is. But the bottom line is the mistletoe doesn't swear that it's not going to harm Balder. And then in some versions of the story, especially the one in the Prose Edda, Loki tricks Hoth, who is blind, into shooting an arrow at Balder that is made out of a mistletoe branch. Now, the version of the story in the Poetic Edda does not mention that. And the thing is that all the gods are throwing stuff at Balder in this kind of insane thing, like, oh yeah, you're invulnerable. Like, let's just hit you with axes and stones and swords and stuff like that. And oh, isn't that hilarious? You're not dying, haha. But then Hoth does in fact hit Balder with an arrow of mistletoe, and that substance is not the one that he was protected against, that Balder was protected against, and Balder dies. And well, leaving the rest of the story apart for a moment, but Hoth kills Balder. That's the bottom line. And what's interesting now here in this poem is that it's significant that Loki is not mentioned. First of all, I find that significant because just by omission, not having Loki as being the agent of the death of Balder, because in the other versions of the story where Loki is considered to be responsible for the death of Balder, he is duly punished, and that's kind of just the way it is. In the Poetic Edda, in the Voluspa, they do imply that the punishment of Loki is due to the events of the death of Baldr because it comes right afterwards. But in this poem, Loki is not mentioned. Hoth is the only one. Hoth is the sole agent. And the thing about Hoth is that there are a couple of other versions of the story that show a different picture to what we see in the Prose Edda and the very little that we get into in the Voluspa. And so the attestations for the death of Baldr, first of all, we know this is an incredibly old story because there are what are known as bracteates, which are these brass plates that were shaped to have these etchings that showed stories, essentially characters. And there's one in particular that I know of, but there might be others that show what appears to be the death of Baldr. In this one bracteate, it's assumed that one character is Hoth, one character is Baldr, and one could be Loki, but it's possible that it's something else because, of course, this is just an image. But this is from like the sixth century. Like this is from a long time ago. These things, yeah. So the story is very old. The story is like at the root of Germanic culture and possibly even further. Like there are parallels to Baldr in other cultures that have relatively similar names across Indo-European civilization. So the story of Baldr could be incredibly old, like very, very, very old. Now, the other places that we can see the story of the death of Baldr taking place, not only these bracteates, which show the age of it, and then the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which we've talked about, but then there is the Gesta Danorum, which is a 12th century book compiled by Saxo Grammaticus, who is a Dane, and Grammaticus essentially just means that he knows how to read and write. That's why he has that name, that title. And he's a Christian. Only like Christian monks were able to do that, were able to read and write, sort of thing. But he compiled a history of the Danes, and that's what the Gesta Danorum is, the history of the Danes. And the story of Baldr, the death of Baldr, is in the Gesta Danorum, but it's framed as a historical source, a historical story. And maybe one day we'll cover this in detail. I only want to get to the main elements here which make the story interesting, and that's that Baldr and Hoth are rivals for the love of a woman, because of course. And they eventually get into a resulting conflict, and Hoth kills Baldr with a sword called mistletoe, misteltein. And it's interesting that it's now turned into a weapon. And I could see the progression there. I could see the progression from just the mistletoe in general, the element or the plant, and then you sort of get a sword called mistletoe. I think the original story would have been the mistletoe itself, but then turning it into a sword, that's kind of ingenious, to be honest. And so what this shows is that Hoth is a much more active participant in the death of Baldr than in previous versions, or in other versions, sorry, not previous. There are other Danish sources too that talk about the death of Baldr. There's a couple of them. And in these, Hoth is a king of the Saxons, and he kills Baldr, who is in these stories as well, still the son of Odin, sort of thing. But in these sources, they say that they are all historical characters, right? So it's not that they're gods anymore. And that's a perfectly good way of Christianity or any other proselytizing religion dealing with elements of the old stories. Even Snorri does it in the beginning of the Prose Edda. He says all the gods are heroes who came from Troy. And that's basically just the part of the Prose Edda that you got to ignore. And but in this case as well, it's like these were deities originally, and then in these Danish sources later, 12th century is when they're from, they would have been sanitized a little bit by making them into historical characters. But Hoth is not the passive actor in these stories that he's assumed to be if Loki is in charge. And so this is all to say that this is all getting revealed. And, well, now Odin is going to find out who's going to kill his son.
Oh, for sure. And one other thing that's interesting, they talk about a long spear that will kill him. Some of the translations have like a kenning that's like a high glory tree, which would be could be a spear as well. And the reason is that this in particular was written in Iceland, where mistletoe doesn't grow, so they'd never seen it before. So it was just like, oh well, if they wouldn't have had that understanding that it's a small berry with, kind of viney, parasitic thing that you probably wouldn't be able to make a spear out of. But they're just like, yeah, well, of course, that's how you kill people. You use a spear. But it's so it's interesting, and you're right. In a lot of the stories, Hoth is sort of this kind of an innocent bystander because he's like blind, and he's not. I get the feeling in a lot of the stories he's kind of invited along because in some places he's understood to be Baldr's brother, and Odin and Frigg's another one of their children. And it's kind of like, yeah, I'll let my brother come along. And, they play the game of throwing stuff at Baldr, which is like the most boy thing ever. It's just, that's of course what they would be doing. It's like, look at this. And then just start, throwing things at him. But it gets to a few things that I want to talk about. One, just with the name Hoth, it's translated as warrior. And you would think, one, it's kind of weird. Like, why would you name a blind god warrior? Because chances, like, he wouldn't do that well fighting, right? He can't see. But in this particular poem, and with one of the stories we're kind of telling with society is that, or at least trying to tell, is that I think it's that you've got this. In the next generation, you always have this vim and vigor, this desire to change the world or just do something, right? That's one of the reasons why all the young men signed up for fight in World War I was, they want to have their adventure. Their fathers had gone off to war and they had, they'd achieved this glory. Well, now it was their turn, and they were going to go off, have this great adventure. They'd be home by Christmas. It was going to be great. We'd be the victors. It was going to be a great celebration, and they would have their glory for their generation. Unfortunately, because, well, at least in World War I, a big part of it was the previous generation kind of hiding things from the next generation. But just in general, the next generation is young and therefore kind of stupid. They don't know what's going on in the world. And, and I'm not putting myself in some grand position where I see what's going on in the world, but like, I'm still young enough to be included in that, like that dumb haze that the young people such as myself have, right? Like we don't necessarily know how the world actually works. We just haven't lived long enough. But that doesn't mean we don't we don't want to change it. Like we might not know what we want to change it into. We might not know what's best, but gosh darn it, we're going to go for it, and we're going to go for it hard. And I also think you can see that a lot in like how willing young people are to go protest for whatever they want, or they just have that energy and that spirit to go forward and make changes, even if they're not sure what the consequences are, but they're just going to go out and do it. And so I wonder if Hoth is kind of that spirit that, well, Plato talks about spiritedness and the importance of directing that spiritedness in young men in particular, but also young women. And so we have Hoth here who actually needs to be directed. He's got all this stuff, but he's blind and needs direction. And it doesn't say in this particular poem, but at least sort of the Snorri Sturluson account of the events, Loki is the one who directs him. And that is one that's exactly right, because he's a trickster. He's got his own ideas of how things should be, and he doesn't have the best hopes for the next generation, but he does have attractive ones, right? Like, well, like killing Balder, like, yeah, it's his brother, and in a lot of the stories he feels bad, and you kind of feel bad for him, because the consequence of killing Balder for Hoth is pretty terrible. But at the same time, it's like, you killed the best and the brightest. That's not trivial. That's like, wow, that's a huge thing. And it shows you the power and the danger in that, the spirit of the young whippersnapper, like we have all these terms for young people, like going off and doing kind of crazy and reckless things because they have that spirit, like whippersnapper, they were too quick with the whip for the horse, right? So this is not unknown. We see it every day. It's embedded in our culture, and it really shows you that you need that spirit is blind, but so you need to direct it properly. Otherwise, it will kill the best and brightest of the next generation.
That's a really interesting take. And honestly, I think that makes that version of the story make a lot more sense, framing it in that particular light. And I mean, maybe just to emphasize something, like Loki being the one who directs Hoth, like, yeah, he's kind of the malicious one, right? Like, often he's malicious, often he's just kind of trickster-ish. But in this particular case, like, that would be malicious out of jealousy, right? And yeah, like, I think that can be a big motivator, as far as if there isn't a solution, but there's someone you're jealous of, sort of thing. Like, yeah, like taking any action against them, that's going to feel pretty good, but the consequences aren't necessarily going to be clear. And I think young folks as well today, and again, I need to include myself in that, of course, but young folks can get directed by negative forces, or forces that are trying to rile up the young generation into taking action. Like, let's go destroy everything that's been set up for all the past however long amount of time. And of course, that's not going to work. But the young people can be angry, can start to, I mean, today, I think young people are the most powerful than ever before, because of things like Twitter and Facebook, and the mobs that can be organized there, or even just like the in real life protests and things that can be generated. And there can be some real world consequences there. And that's all just to say, though, is that if someone is young, and if youth in general is inexperienced, which I think we essentially agree is the case, it can be a lot easier to direct them into basically whatever. And I don't want to go so far as to say like manipulated, but on some level, I think that really is the case that happens.
I would agree with that. And I think, I think resentment is one of the key things that can be used to manipulate people. Like Hoth, I don't know, it doesn't say anything about him resenting his brother, but at least in Snorri's version, Loki certainly resents, the gods for various reasons, and he's able to he taps into that resentment to do these malicious things, these things that aren't just him being a trickster and funny. And I think we see a lot of resentment today, just in general. And one of the reasons for that is that we can see through all the social media, one, we're getting like the greatest hits of everyone's life. So if you're having a bad day, you go on social media and you just see like how great everyone else is living except for you. Well, yeah, that's going to breed resentment. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but there's an idea that, for example, poverty leads to crime. And that's only like half of the story. The other half is that it's poverty in close proximity to largesse and great prosperity that generally leads to crime. But now that we have social media and we can see all the greatest hits of everyone, it doesn't matter where you are. Chances are you're going to be impoverished, whether or not it's like financially, and whether or not you actually are. I mean, you'd be living like pretty middle class, not real your physical needs taken care of, like comfortably, but then you're seeing on social media, a celebrity who's got, a house that could fit 3 of your houses, and 10 more cars than you that cost the same as your house, like all this stuff. Like, yeah, like that's going to breed resentment, and that's going to lead to a breakdown in society that we're going to see. So it's just interesting that, one, we can kind of draw that parallel between society and this little poem, but also the danger in, I guess, letting forces direct that spiritedness in young people that may not have their best interest in heart.
Yeah, and the whole thing about the way the resentment works as far as young people goes, it's 100% true all of the time that the younger generation is less rich than their parents, because their parents have been working for their entire lives, presumably, at least on a total level, right? And the generation before that has more resources because, again, longer time in the game. And so the thing about it is that there's a couple of issues with the whole, okay, so if the solution is just kind of get in the game and get going, there's some legitimate gripes, such as, say, it was a lot easier in the 50s, 60s, 70s for young folks to get ahead at that period of time. And that's reasonable enough. And that's a whole other topic to tackle. Not in this podcast, by the way, not in this episode, not in the podcast in general, probably. But the other relatively legitimate thing as well is that people are living a lot longer, and it takes longer for, say, wealth to trickle down through the generations, because that's kind of the idea of how it works. And even if wealth is generally seen as staying within families and things like that, though, it's actually over the course of time measured that fortunes tend to only last 3 generations. There's the one that develops it in the first place, which would not have had anything themselves. They would have at best been, like, say, middle class or something like that, but probably more likely poor or less well off, something like that. And so they're motivated to succeed, and a lot of things go right for them. That's, of course, something, but then they build this fortune, and then they give their children all the things that they were deprived of. And so that generation is a little more, the next generation is a little less good with the money, and by the third generation it tends to fully, completely collapse. And maybe it's not a complete collapse, maybe it's like you're just pretty well off, not like ultra billionaires sort of thing, but it's that's tends to be the way society, well, the way you see wealth kind of going around in society. And that all just is to say that a lot of the common topics of resentment for young folks these days, it's not that they're not legitimate, and on a micro level, yeah, some people are struggling. Like, that is absolutely true. That can't be ignored. The solution, though, isn't necessarily to just go throw away the entire system, because when it's like, oh yeah, well, it was easier to get ahead 50 years ago, my response is kind of like, well, yep, what are you going to do about that? Like, what do you propose? Do you propose the entire system change itself to make it easier for you? Like, that's not trivial. And maybe you could try trying to get ahead yourself, trying to better yourself, get some skills, get a job sort of thing, and see where that gets you in a few years. And I mean, that can be harsh. That sounds a bit harsh, but it's the reality is that tends to actually lead to pretty good outcomes for people, especially if you're already starting in the global 1%, which for the most part, anyone in the Western world is essentially in the global 1% for the most part. Not everyone, not literally everyone, but you're in the global 5%, 10% for sure. So that's just something there. And that really is not to say that the concerns of the new generation are not real and to trivialize them, but it's also like there's an element of not thinking a couple of steps through the process, like what is the implication or how is this going to get done to get any better. It's just that something's wrong, we should fix it, but there's no genuine solutions. Like pick it, like inequality, climate change, any of them. It's kind of like with climate change, it's like yeah, like sure there's a problem, but like what are we going to do, completely dismantle all of industrialized civilization? Like that's basically the only thing at the moment that's going to completely stop climate change and all the policies that are floated, right, that are just completely overhauling the system. That's going to be hard to do and hard to see the consequences, right? And so going to a march or a rally for climate change, like that's all well and good, but there's no solutions, and we got smart people trying to figure out solutions, and it's just really hard to get there, sort of thing. And so that's maybe the whole point, and that's why I find it interesting the way you frame the whole Hoth Loki story. That version of the story makes a lot more sense to me now.
Yeah, but then we also have these other versions that are very also very archetypal and archetypally correct. Like I love when you said Hoth and Baldr were competing for the affections of a woman because of course, and it's like yes, that's why men compete. It's to get the affection of a woman. And I guess I imagine one day we'll go through the works of Saxo Grammaticus. So maybe it's probably worth it to save a huge discussion for it then. But just to say that there is, in all these versions, there are interesting and useful things to learn that do apply, across the board. So, but yeah, I was reading some of those other versions, and it's fascinating how they came up with them. I also like, because it's 12th century, he Latinizes a lot of the names. So it's like what Baldarius or something and Hotharius. I like the actual names. They're pretty cool. Shall we move on with Baldr's Dream?
Let's do it.
This will be stanzas 10 and 11. Back to the poem. Odin said, "Don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more till I understand everything. And I want to know more. Who will avenge Hoth's crime? Who will put Baldr's killer on the funeral pyre?" The witch said, "In halls to the west, Rind will give birth to your son Valley. He will avenge Baldr when he is only 1 night old. He will neither comb his hair nor wash his hands till he puts Baldr's killer on the funeral pyre. I was forced to speak. Now I return to silence."
Yeah, so I've got a lot to say about this one too. So first of all, something I didn't even get into last time was that Odin keeps saying he wants to know more, understand everything. And first of all, that just gets into Odin's character on a deep level, as far as like Odin is the one who searches for knowledge. He doesn't want to be willfully blind to the things that he could know. He wants to know more. He wants to understand everything. So first of all, that's just really good here. And he keeps on pushing. This is tough information to get through. This isn't easy. This isn't easy to understand or parse or anything like that. And so I think it's just important to see that Odin wants to know everything, even though it's not the best subject matter. Like he's not coddling himself. He's not shying away from information that is hard to handle, hard to deal with. Now, the thing is, what we're dealing with here is that Odin was almost taking it for granted that someone is going to avenge the death of Baldr, right? So even if he's just understanding this now, it's like it's a given that someone is going to go and avenge Baldr's death by killing Hoth. And on some level, that's kind of like, that can seem harsh, first of all, if Hoth is just this blind guy who isn't responsible for it necessarily. The thing about it, though, is the consequences are still his, and it works on the archetypal level, too. Like, even if you're misguided, whatever, it's like the responsibility is still yours. Like, you can't take the responsibility away from the person actually doing the action. You know what I mean? Because even if it is some young person who is blind on a symbolic level and they go and commit some heinous crime, of course, maybe you want to go look into the reasons behind said crime, or like their motivations, things like that. But they still need to be held responsible. And I think, I mean, there's plenty of examples of young men who are, say, school shooters, and I won't talk about the specific examples, sort of thing, but a lot of these guys, like, they'll put out manifestos or things like that talk about their motivations, and of course, in the aftermath of all these things, these motivations get talked about, and the reasons why they've done these things, that gets talked about. And as a solution to the problem, there's always these things of dealing with the deeper issues that may have caused this young person to go and commit these violent acts, sort of thing. But they're still going to put this person in prison, or if they were even lucky enough to survive the encounter, sort of thing. I say lucky, but you still go put the person in prison. You still go exercise the full extent of the law, even if they were maybe misguided by certain ideas, or they were influenced by other people, sort of thing. Yeah, go handle that. Go take care of the people who maybe were responsible for these bad things happening, kind of on a root level, but you still punish the person who enacts these terrible acts. And so Hoth, on that level, for sure, that's like, yeah, his death is going to be avenged. And the other side of it too is, of course, if Hoth was fully the agent of Baldr's death, like he was doing it intentionally, then yeah, that makes complete sense. But I have a different direction to take this in a little bit. So the symbolic level of Baldr, him being the ideal, as we've been talking about, the potential, the next generation, all that. Whoever kills the ideal on a symbolic level, and I'll even go so far as to say whatever kills the ideal, that has to be dealt with. There's no way getting around that which has killed the ideal. That which has killed the ideal is almost its own thing on a psychological level at that point. And I don't have a great concrete example of what this looks like. It makes sense in my head, and I'm trying to explain it the best I can. But it's something like you have to handle the thing that threw you into chaos. You have to take care of the root cause. And Baldr dying and going into the underworld, that's definitely being thrown into chaos. Like your potential, your ideal is no longer possible, and that can just hit super hard, right? And the whatever caused the ideal to die, whatever caused that, has to be addressed, as far as if you're going to be able to move on from that in any meaningful way, you have to deal with that which has killed the ideal. So Hoth has to be dealt with, and the one who's going to do that is Vali.
Well, you know, it's very similar to what Nietzsche talks about in the Death of God. And, God is dead and we have killed him. And then he later goes on to say there's not enough water in the world to wash away the blood from the death of God. Well, he's in those few lines, he's very much describing what happens here, and that Baldr is this ideal. If you look at God as the the highest good of all things, the top of all dominance hierarchies, and the best possible outcomes of everything. And then you kill that. Like, what do you replace it with, right? And, what better way to kill it than with this blind warrior, like brother god that in a lot of ways, in other circumstances, I'm sure, like having your brother be a warrior and blind, sure, we can direct him. Well, that's pretty good. That's useful. There's use for it. It's not inherently, intrinsically evil or bad. But if you have the wrong thing directing it, you do kill an ideal. And there are serious consequences to that. And you do unleash forces on the world that were kept at bay by that ideal, whatever it is. And one of the things that is unleashed is Vali, this god of vengeance. There isn't a clear etymological origin for the name, but they generally think it's something like the arguing one or the conflicting one. So something very, very related to battle. And the idea that he doesn't comb his hair or bathe or wash his hands, there's a lot symbolically going on with that. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with hair in relation to death. So in some cultures, like in the Greek cultures, you would cut your hair as a sign of mourning. In Roman times, you would let your hair grow as a sign of mourning. In Judaism, you don't do anything with your hair and you don't bathe when you're in a time of mourning, because you're not supposed to worry about anything else other than just your grief for this person's death. And like throughout the world, you can find different methods of fashioning your hair in order to show your mourning and actually vengeance. I mean, something that I found very interesting was unkempt hair, especially among like deities in Hinduism. The way it's sort of separated down the line between, like, if you've got good hair, like well put together hair, or messy hair. If you've got hair that's brushed and put together, then chances are you're one of the gods. But if it's messy and unkempt and uncut, then you're one of the holy demons. And I was wondering, because of the shared origin of Hinduism and European mythology, the Indo-European starting point, I was wondering if this is kind of like Vali is one of those gods that is more like demon, and he's being unleashed, and he's immediate and swift and terrible and terrifying. And even his birth, again, Odin gets this child through rape, by raping Ryan. And I think is it Saxo Grammaticus who writes about that, where he convinces the king to tie her up and then rapes her, and then Vali is the one that comes out, and he's literally holy vengeance. Some of the other creatures, like in Greek mythology, the Gorgon, so like Medusa, is known for her wild, untamed hair. Like it's a sign of, and this would go through many cultures, because long hair is a sign of power in a lot of cultures. It's like wild, untamed power that you can't control. And that's exactly what Hoth has coming after him, a day after this being is born. So it's terrifying. Like the consequences for Hoth, even if we take him as kind of this, not innocent bystander, but kind of like tragic victim of circumstance, the punishment doesn't matter for the punishment. The punishment's still going to be wild and powerful and terrifying.
Definitely. And the Vali character is interesting as this instrument of revenge. And first of all, yeah, his birth is quite something. And yeah, as you said, it's not referenced here, but Odin does rape Rind, Vali's mother. And that is literally unjustifiable, and I'm not doing that. I am not justifying that, just like in our previous poems, which have talked about Odin's sexual practices. We do not justify any of those things on a literal level. On a symbolic level, it's a little bit different, because on a symbolic level, the union between Odin and any woman is really Odin trying to create something new for the future. And so, I mean, that shows why he basically is he's a well he goes and will basically have sex with anyone, is what we tend to hear. Zeus is the same way in Greek mythology too, and Zeus is essentially a meme for the level of just he'll go have sex with anyone. And he has the same problem too, with a lot of it being technically rape as well. So the top of the dominance hierarchy goes and will basically have sex with anyone. And on the one hand, that is reminiscent of, first of all, how things would have been in general. The most successful man in just about any society could have any woman he wants and as many women he wants, because he has the capability, the resources to take care of the women and any resulting children. And so that's how the world would have worked until enforced monogamy essentially came into effect, which is marriage. It's you can only one man, only one woman, and that's it. And that really is to prevent one guy getting all the women, essentially. And the horde of men who don't get to have any women, that would cause problems for society as well. But on another level, it's also that Odin goes and spends time in the form of chaos that is potential. Because we talk about chaos a lot. We talk about order, we talk about chaos, and there's different kinds of chaos or different aspects of it. There's going into the underworld, which is like, that's a tough time. You're doing something dangerous, and it better darn well be worthwhile to do that. And then there's going out into just the unknown in general, which is, most of the world is unknown, but you can generally handle it. That's kind of Jotunheim. But then the type of chaos that actually has potential and creating something new, that is completely symbolized by the sexual union of a man and a woman. That's the symbol across cultures, across time. It's universal. And so anytime that Odin does this and either has children or is just having a good time for him, not so necessarily a good time for the woman, what he is doing is he is trying to create something new in potential. And so this particular situation, the death of Baldr, the death of his son, Odin's reaction to that is to go create a child in equally terrible circumstances, difficult for the mother, of course, on a literal level. Yeah, again, unjustifiable literally, but symbolically it's violent, messy. This is the internal struggle of how to produce something that can take care of, okay, this is going to be like a winding sentence. You're creating that which is necessary to defeat that which killed the ideal, if that makes sense. So Vali is what is necessary to defeat Hod, who killed Baldr, the ideal. And so Vali, on a symbolic level, I think psychologically, is whatever you have to do in order to move on from the death of the ideal, from the death of Baldr. And so what he represents is like he's got a sole purpose. His vengeance is like it. And I don't think we really see Vali elsewhere that often. Like, I think he's mentioned a couple of times in passing in other stories, but this is like his moment. This is like his time. And what he is for Odin is almost, it's not necessarily closure, but it is dealing with the immediate consequences of the death of Baldr, the death of the ideal, the death of potential. I only repeat it so much because it's like these symbols are so important to understanding this story. And yeah, Vali is like a literal agent of this stuff. And And so the meaning of Vali to me gets just this whole deeper meaning, because not only like his birth makes exact sense here, because it's like, if you're thrown into chaos, you're going to be struggling. You're going to be in conflict. Even his names could work as like argument or whatever, any of the etymologies for it. And figuring out how to deal with that can be tough, difficult, but necessary. And yeah, the Vali is just really interesting. And that's the totality of this couple of stanzas, is how you deal with the aftermath of the death of Baldr.
Definitely. And you have Vali, and I like what you said, that he's sort of the necessary consequence. It reminds me, I think it was Winston Churchill talked about this, but I could be wrong. And if I am, feel free to correct it. But basically talking about rough men at the borders that keep the other rough men away. You know, that you need people who, you basically need your own, like, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes if you're listening, like, you know, bad guys to fight off the other bad guys. But they're not bad guys to you because they're on your team. But you need those rough people who are willing and able to do the things that, you know, common folk might not have the stomach for. And I mean, and I don't want this to sound in any way disrespectful, but if you look at any of the Navy SEALs, like, they are able to do things that most people cannot fathom doing. And thank goodness for that, right? Like, they have that real warrior spirit. It actually, if you're going to look at like archetypes, again, it's that warrior archetype who, you know, they love the thrill of combat, and, you know, they're able to do other things too. I remember hearing someone like talking about the armed forces saying, you know, we need good soldiers. You might not want to take them home to meet your parents or whatever, which you can say that about anyone really, but in a lot of cases, actually, you do, because they're fun people. They just have that ability to go to that warring place that other folks don't have, you know. So and that's kind of that's good to know, because when you're doing something as grand as destroying an ideal, you have to know that the consequences to that are going to be swift and uncompromising and coming for you. And there's nothing, like, maybe you can fight against it, but there isn't really anything you can do to stop the consequences. It's coming for you. And this is what we see, is we have these consequences coming for Hoth that are necessary, because you can't have it any other way. And even if you tried to mitigate, the consequences would find a way to come and get you. Like, kind of reminds me of one of my favorite movies, No Country for Old Men, and Anton Chigurh. You think you're okay, and you're trying to run away. You get rid of the tracking device and the bag of money, but he still finds you, and he has to carry out his duty of, you know, using the cattle stunner to blow the lock in the hotel doorway and then killing you, right? Like, there's no choice. And that's what we see here, is that there are consequences for all of our actions, and you have to face them. So, kind of a dire warning, but it's also good to be aware of, because then you can at least have in the back of your mind that, okay, this is going to cause consequences. Maybe I can be prepared for some of them, or at least know that it's coming.
Yeah, a couple of other nuances that I see here based on all that is that the consequences, although they're necessary, it's maybe one of those things that you don't want to have the consequences. You know what I mean? Like, society in general, I think we would love if we didn't have to have prisons or extreme punishments for violence or anything like that. But violence does happen, negative things happen, and you have to have those consequences. And so maybe the whole idea of Vali's birth is that it's sort of like it's reluctant, and you don't want to have it, and you don't want to have to need Vali, but you do because someone killed Baldr, and you have to deal with that right away. And the flip side of it too, the other thing I was going to mention was that if you don't kill Hoth, Hoth wins. Hoth wins, or whoever is behind Hoth, right? If there aren't consequences for the people who did this, you have tyranny. You have violence with impunity. And society needs to not have that. That cannot be allowed. You cannot be allowed to commit violence with impunity. And of course, there's certain exceptions such as self-defense, but that's sort of like, well, you've prevented violence from being done to you, and so that's completely different. But yeah, just the nuances here. I think the entire thing makes sense on a society level and on a psychological level, which is awesome. Like, we love when that happens, right?
Definitely. And I was just thinking, our legal system is set up in exactly this way. When if you commit crime, when you go to court in Canada, it's not, you beat up John Smith. It's not John Smith versus you. It's the Queen versus you, because she is the top of the society's hierarchy, at least in Canada, symbolically. But in the US, it's the people, because the people are the top of the hierarchy, and it's the people versus whoever, So we take that into account, that society itself has to defend itself against these things and has to punish it, because they can't allow this type of thing to happen. So it's so ingrained in our own lives that we don't even notice it, but like, Valley is always there waiting for us.
Yeah, on some level, I see this entire story of the death of Baldr really being like dealing with tragedy, kind of on a general level, and how to cope with that, and whether it's malicious or not, you still have to deal with it, right? You still have to deal with that aftermath, and that's the psychological side to this. And the entire story, I always say, and maybe it's a little bit whatever. I always say that these stories amaze me just in how much understanding of the world that they have baked right in there. And getting to dig into this stuff and really explore it is so awesome. But this story is just something else in terms of the way it encapsulates the understanding of what happens in the aftermath of tragedy and how you have to deal with it. It's a blueprint for it. And the legal system that the Norse would have had, they did have ways of not going kind of back and forth, tit for tat sort of thing all the time. And that's not something good either, because whoever kills Hoth, then Hoth's family should theoretically then go and kill Vali, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there were ways of having that not be the case. But the totality of this story here is kind of outside of it. It's kind of outside the whole specific cases of say death or murder or whatever, and I think it deals with such a huge universal, which is tragedy, loss of life, loss of potential, all of this, and it works on society, it works on psychology. It works on so many levels. It's a great story.
Well, that's one of the things we haven't talked about this in quite a few episodes, but I think it's worth bringing up here. We live in a materialistic world because of science, right? Science explains so many things, and so we take a lot of things at just face value. But before the scientific revolution, people looked at the world in relation to what it meant to themselves. So, for example, when we think of water, it's H2O, which is like useful in knowing what elements go to make it, but completely useless in knowing, like, well, what does water mean? Well, it's a drink, keeps you alive. It's wet. Like, all these things that kind of describe our interaction with it. Like the scientific materialistic way of understanding it doesn't tell us anything. But the way that they looked at the world, the pre-scientific way of looking at the world, and the way of figuring out what it means, and specifically in relation to your own life. We still live like that. We just have a materialist mind about it because of science, but we don't care. we still don't care too much, about H2O. We care a lot about having clean water to drink. And that's why there's so much meaning where we've kind of conflated the idea of, water being H2O. And I mean this in a general sense. We've conflated water being H2O with what water does for us and what it means to us in life. We clean with it. We drink it. It's, well, think of all the sayings we have, like, the water of life. Like, it just, you can't turn on your TV without seeing an advertisement donate to someone who's going to make sure there's clean water in some, poor village, right? So, but if it's just H2O, like, who cares? It's just H2O. It's elements put together. And that's what we're getting out of here, is that we're finding the meaning again in these stories. And it's, the scientific materialist way of looking at it is, just mythology. It's just an old story. And that's face value. But if we can sort of try and put that lens back on of, well, what's the meaning of it? That's when we're able to find all these different levels and how they all work together. And that's, life in itself, right? Like, we're not just, I will go as far as saying we're not just materialist beings. There is something more to us that we don't really have a good explanation for. But when we hear these stories and stories throughout the world, every culture has them, that these stories that mean something and explain the world around them. Like, that's kind of the point of this. It's not, this is an historical account of this story that was told, to people. It's like, well, that's cool, but, like, what does it mean? And yeah, so we haven't talked about it in a little while, but that's one of the things we're doing, is that we're trying to find meaning behind sort of the cool, just materialist history of it, right? And that's why it connects so well, and that's why I don't know, it always seems like these stories are quite familiar, and I think it's because, like, we can recognize what it's talking about, even though, we aren't gods and we aren't living mythological times.
Exactly. And, if we're looking at these stories and they seem obvious, it's for that reason. It's because we are dealing with these things that are, on a deep level, symbolically significant. And if it seems like what we're talking about is really clear, or really that we're reading so much into this stuff, the meaning is there, but I think we've lost sight of it. We've lost sight of what all these stories actually mean beyond the literal. Like, these stories can't be taken only literally. These stories can't be just the literal story of Baldr and Odin and Hoth and all that. They have to be the symbols behind it, the archetypal narrative. You need that, or else these stories lose all of their meaning. And so, taking the lessons from these stories and putting them all the way to essentially all of these levels that we talk about, well, we end up getting so many layers of meaning, and it just makes sense, and it should make sense, because top to bottom, these stories mean something, and that's what we're exploring. So,
and we could be doing this with stories from around the world. You pick any culture, and we would be able to find very similar themes in a lot of them. Like, that's a really cool part. And that's earlier when I was talking about human nature. That's a really neat part, where you can see, like, this is seen everywhere in the world. This is probably something of what it means to be human. But before we go on too much more about that, should we finish off the poem?
let's finish it off.
Sounds good. This will be stanzas 12 to 15. It's only 15 stanzas in this poem. We've already gone on for a while.
Almost 2 hours.
Odin said, "Don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more, till I understand everything, and I want to know more. Who are the women who weep in longing, who throw their necklaces up into the sky?" The witch said, "You are not Road Tamer, like I thought you were. No, you are Odin, the aged god." Odin said, "You are neither a witch nor a wise woman. No, you are the mother of 3 monsters." The witch said, "Ride home, Odin, feel triumphant for now. But you will come for a second visit when Loki breaks free from his chains, and Ragnarok comes to end everything."
Well, that's it for Baldr's dreams. Now, the ending here is a little dramatic in its foreshadowing, and that's a lot of fun, always a lot of fun. I'll start from the beginning here, though. The women weeping and longing, I don't actually have too much on this, and what's interesting there is the question never gets properly answered. The witch doesn't answer his questions. She's stopped answering his questions. Now, what I found interesting was somehow Odin's question is what reveals that he is Odin somehow. So the witch is saying, "Oh, you're not Road Tamer like I thought you were. You're Odin." And so somehow the question of these women who are weeping must be something like Odin is seeing the future. And on some level, maybe he's seeing the future, but maybe he's also seeing the natural progression of things that would take place if Baldr were to die, and there would be women weeping and longing for him. I don't have much else for that in particular, to be honest, because first of all, the question wasn't answered, but also because I don't know exactly what that adds. Certainly grief, that is something, but I don't know what else that adds to the picture. But we get off track here instantly. So Odin gets found out. He retorts back really quickly, the mother of 3 monsters, and that's interesting enough as well. Like, he's comparing her with some of the worst characters in Norse mythology, essentially, or just in general. I mean, just that sounds like a really bad insult. But the foreshadowing here, I think that's the most interesting part of how this ends, and it's foreshadowing Ragnarok, which we've talked about before in the Voluspa, how the death of Baldr essentially is the foreshadowing to Ragnarok. Like, the death of the ideal is what brings Ragnarok about, because in the aftermath of the loss of the symbolic ideal, you have to, the world has to end in order to be reborn. And spoiler, Baldr is supposed to come back at the end of Ragnarok, but you have to have Ragnarok first. And Ragnarok is the death of everything you know, the death of the entire world. And on that symbolic psychological level, that's what makes sense, because you have to kill off the part of yourself that is unable to live with the death of Baldr, and then he can return. A new ideal can emerge after the fact. And so foreshadowing Ragnarok is the perfect thing to tie it to, in my opinion, to end it off.
Absolutely. Just a few things. There's some thought that the women weeping refers to the deal that is made with Hell, that if they can get everyone in the world to cry and mourn for Baldr, then she will let him back into the world. And of course, Loki takes the form of a giantess and refuses to cry, and therefore the deal is broken. There's an idea that those are the women he might be referring to. And then calling her mother of 3 monsters, I wondered if that meant she was Angrabotha, one of Loki's wives, and mother of Hel, the Midgard serpent, and Fenrir. And that's interesting in itself, in that he's gone to, and Odin seems surprised by this, but that he's getting sort of otherworldly advice from the mother of the creatures who bring about the end of the world. Hell's interesting because she rules over the sort of land of the dead, the underworld. There is talk that a lot of the dead come back during Ragnarok to fight, and then the Midgard serpent, he of course fights with Thor and kill each other, and that's really how the world comes to an end. Finally, is that once they're both dead, everything crashes and burns and sort of fades away back into the nether. And then Fenrir, of course. Fenrir is interesting. The name means fen dweller, and a fen is the liminal space because it's both water and land. And so he's on the margins, and Fenrir actually helps destroy the margins of the world. He opens up his mouth, and his lower jaw eats the earth, and his upper jaw eats the sky. So he's destroying the very boundaries between heaven and earth. So that what happens then? Right? It's just there's nothing. And he eats Odin, who is in some ways the hero of the previous generation, who was able to straddle the line between chaos and order, and then is killed by Vidar, the silent god. And just because there's no more in silence, there's no boundary, right? There's no liminal space. It's all the same. It's just silence. And so that's interesting. We'll definitely get into more of that later on. But, as she's then foreshadows Ragnarok and saying, oh, you'll come back to talk to me then. And it's believed that this is actually a reference to the Voluspa, and that she is the same dead witch that Odin raises and talks to and goes through all of the, in much greater detail. And one of the things I only noticed as we were doing this podcast, as we were reading, you had brought it up, Odin is always saying, I want, don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you more till I understand everything, and I want to know more. And during the Voluspa, as she's telling him all of these horrendous and terrible things, she's like, oh, would you like to know more? And it's this, I've always taken it as kind of this mocking question that you came to me once. And when we first did the Voluspa, that was our first episode, so we didn't have this knowledge, but hearing him say that again, I want to know more. Oh, do you want to know more? And then she just keeps telling stuff. Seeing that, I was like, oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's a great ending and ties it back into the rest of the Poetic Edda nicely. We definitely know that this is a contributing part of the Poetic Edda for sure. Honestly, I think I don't really have much more here on this poem because it's been so dense and we've talked about so many different things here, but leaving it on the foreshadowing of Ragnarok and Odin coming to visit again, I think that's pretty cool.
Me too. Yeah, I don't have much more to say about this particular poem, so it's probably a good spot to, I guess, to stop and talk about some of our normal things we talk about at the end of our podcast, about how people can get in touch with us. We're on all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're various versions of Northern Myths Podcast. On Twitter, we're at Northern Myths. We're also on Twitter ourselves at North Myth Dan and at North Myth Luke. Instagram is Northern Myths Podcast. You can find us on YouTube. Just Google. Well, actually, you can Google and it'll show up on as a YouTube link. But on YouTube, the Northern Myths Podcast, we always a subscribe, comments, all that kind of stuff is all great for us. Leaving a review on whichever platform you listen to, and especially iTunes, is great for us because it helps us stay at sort of the top of the the search algorithm and gets us in front of more people, which is always appreciated. And then we also have a t-shirt store or swag store where, t-shirts and mugs right now. And the big one, of course, is Patreon. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Patreon, Luke?
Sure, yeah. The Patreon, we're patreon.com/Northern Myths, and there's a couple of ways you can support us there if you like. We base it on a per episode basis because we don't necessarily have a completely regular schedule, and so we wouldn't want to have a month with not much happening and get charged for it, sort of thing. But yeah, if you'd like to support us there, we have our episodes available early for if you support $5 or more per episode, and that's basically as early as I finish editing it for the most part, and then it gets uploaded for you if you choose to be a patron. And we also try to give regular updates to what's going on with the show, a little bit of behind the scenes access there. I've started to kind of turn it into like a little blog for kind of everything that's been going on. So that's just what you get. And of course, you can contact us through the Patreon, and we'll definitely respond to you there for sure. We try to respond on all platforms as just a general rule. We still tend to have the time to respond to all the messages we get. They're not so frequent that we can't get to them in a timely manner. But then on the Patreon, though, you'll definitely be able to reach us and chat with us. And yeah, we just appreciate the support, and any proceeds of the Patreon will go to us making some upgrades. We should be set for our hosting for another year now with the current level we're at. And yeah, we're just kind of working our way towards upgrading a few things so we can make the podcast even better quality, and so we can just do more and make it the best show we possibly can. So every bit of support is, of course, really appreciated. And you can find us again at patreon.com/Northern Myths.
I know one of the sort of the pie in the sky dreams we have would be to taking the show on the road sometime and like having like a live Northern Myth podcast recording, but that's a little ways off, but that's like, that's the dream. You can also support us through our Amazon affiliate links. We've got recommended books and music books, for example, like the Poetic Edda, as translated by Dr. Jackson Crawford. You can also get the audio version of it where he reads it out. And if you're not watching his videos on YouTube, you should be, because they're fantastic. But he also has a very good reading voice if you haven't heard it before, and highly recommend that you check out the audio version so you can have, the good doctor reading these stories to you. Trying to think. Got the recommended books, recommended music. The music is from guests we've had on the show. And I think that's about it, but am I forgetting anything?
Well, Dan, the only thing left, and it's everything that we're trying to do with this show, but the only thing left for you is to go forth and find the myth that you're living.
This is the Northern Myths podcast. Thank you very much for listening.